Hear me? Can you guys hear me in the back? No? Can you hear me now? Great. Welcome to our event today. I'm Ted Miguel from the economics department here at UC Berkeley. We are delighted to host a book talk by Bill Easterly, who's come out here from NYU. A couple things. First, the room is full. So if others can't fit, we're actually going to live stream the event on SIGA's Twitter feed. So you can check it out that way. Before getting started, I'd just like to give an introduction to our speaker and give you a sense of what the event will look like. We are really lucky to have Bill here today. He's one of the leading thinkers about international development in the world today. He's been extremely influential. He's influenced me a lot personally. My PhD dissertation was really just a derivative of some of Bill's work, so I thank him for for inspiring me to do that research. Actually work with Ross Levine, who's sitting here, their paper together. So we're really lucky to have them both here. Bill's a professor of economics at NYU and also director of the NYU Development Research Institute. He has several extremely influential books that have pushed and shaped the development policy debate over the last decade or so, including The Elusive Quest for Growth, The White Man's Burden, and now The Tyranny of Experts, the book he'll speak about today. Bill is an accomplished scholar with scores of peer-reviewed articles. He's one of the most cited economists in the world and has a range of other honors in the profession. And I think what's so unique about Bill is he really bridges the worlds of academia, doing the most sort of rigorous articles in prestigious journals, but he bridges that world with public debate. And so he's very rare among scholars in being a leading technical researcher and also being a leading public intellectual. So I know I'm really excited to hear what he has to say today, and there's at least 3 or 4 of you out there that agree this is a great place to be. And before launching in and letting Bill get into his talk, let me just lay out what the afternoon will look like. Bill's going to give a talk, then we're going to have a question and answer period. I believe just with the numbers, we're going to have cards that are passed out. That'll be passed to the front, and that'll start the conversation. And then there's going to be a book signing as well. So that's how it's going to be laid out. I want to thank the Blum Center for sponsoring the talk, and this is a great space for it. And the Blum Center is a close partner of SIGA's, the center that I direct here, Center for Effective Global Action, and just delighted to be able to share the afternoon with you guys. So without further ado, Professor Bill Easterly.
Thank you, Ted. Let me do my own sound check. Is this working in the back? Raise your hand if you're having trouble hearing me. If you're struggling to hear me, raise your hand. Let's try it the other way. If you can hear me very easily, raise your hand in the back. Okay, good. So let's use this as a metaphor. I'm a Democrat. I wanted feedback whether you could hear me. Because of that, the system is working. You can hear me. If I'd been an autocrat and you had raised your hand, I would have put you in jail for daring to challenge the quality of my voice. File that away. We're going to use that metaphor in a little bit. So this book, called The Tyranny of Experts, seems to be upset about something experts are doing. Experts are defined as, the bad experts I'm talking about do not include anyone in this room. The primary bad idea the book is attacking is what we could call the technocratic approach to development. It thinks of development as just a long list of technical problems of the poor. The poor are vulnerable to malaria, you give out bed nets. The poor, or you can also spray the residences of the poor with a chemical on the indoor walls that kill the mosquitoes and solve the technical problem of malaria, a chemical called pyrethrum, if you want to be really, really technical. And you just get a long list of technical solutions like that, and you think that is development. That's the technocratic misconception about how development happens that the book is attacking. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about aid. I'm not talking about philanthropy. I'm talking about how development happens. The big picture of how a whole society emerges out of poverty into prosperity, that's what we're talking about. And the confusion between aid and development is something that we're going to be talking about a lot about in this session today. So what I'm talking about is development. So the World Bank itself is a good example of sort of the technocratic approach. In fact, it actually has in its own Articles of Agreement this phrase, which says it's not allowed to consider, this is a hallmark of the technocratic approach, that it's neutral with respect to political systems. It's not allowed to consider the political character of the member states that the World Bank is lending to. And then it says it can only economic considerations can be taken into account by the World Bank in deciding who to lend to. And the World Bank thinks it is doing development by doing this. Now, the illusion here is the idea that economic considerations don't involve the political system. That's the central illusion that this whole book is about. And that's simply false. And to give you an idea of how that could be false, let me tell you a pretty sad story about how the technocratic approach can go wrong that involved a World Bank loan. So there was a World Bank loan that wanted to take a piece of land in Uganda, in Mubende district, Uganda, and convert it from food crops to forestry, which would produce higher value. So that sounds like a good technical solution that would raise some people's incomes. Here's how it was actually implemented. On February 28th, the year 2010, the villagers on a Sunday morning were in church and they heard the sound of gunfire outside. They come out, and men with guns are burning down their homes, their crops, killing their livestock. They were kept at gunpoint from rescuing their homes that were burning down. There was an 8-year-old child that died in the fire. So clearly something has gone badly wrong here. That what seemed like a straightforward technical solution was not a technical solution. It's precisely because the political and economic rights of these poor people were not respected. And what's sad about this story, and what's reflective of kind of the absence of enough debate on the rights of the poor, what the book calls the forgotten rights of the poor, is what happened next. What's unusual about this story is that this story actually showed up on the front page of the New York Times a few months later. And the World Bank was momentarily embarrassed, and they promised the next day to do an investigation. And then there were really two non-events that happened after that. First, the World Bank never did an investigation. And second, nobody in development really protested that they did not do an investigation, that this event happened, that there was... And so 4 years later, this event has basically been forgotten by almost everyone. That's the forgotten rights of the poor. That's the weak spot of the technocratic approach. So let's instead kind of put two propositions on the table. The first is that the rights of the poor are a good thing in and of themselves, regardless of what their sort of pragmatic consequences is, which is what point 2 will be about. That the rights of poor people to make their own choices, to consent to what happens to them, to be protected against violence like what happened in Mubende district, Uganda, to make political choices that would allow them to protest when something bad like that happens to them, and to drive out of office any bad politicians that do things like that to them. These political and economic rights, these are a good thing in and of themselves. We don't need any more justification than that. Now, that doesn't automatically close off the argument to say that. There could be other good things that are good things in themselves that might compete with this good thing, and we're going to have to talk about that. Or you might think that I'm wrong, that maybe the poor don't care about their political and economic rights. So I'm not shutting off the debate. I'm just saying we do have to have this debate on whether the political and economic rights of the poor are a good thing in and of themselves. And I want to say my own values are that they are. These are good things in and of themselves. And then the second point is these political and economic rights actually do make development happen. So this sort of simple, and here we're talking about some very simple, I'm almost embarrassed how simple these principles are. They're really Econ 101 and Politics 101. That political and economic rights create like a problem-solving society that makes development happen. That the ability, our economic rights give us the ability to reward private problem solvers with profits and drive out of business anyone who fails to solve our problems. I periodically keep trying to drive Delta Airlines out of business for that reason, so far with not enough success. And we also have political rights that allow us to do the same thing, to reward the public problem solvers who solve our problems, and to drive out of office those who do harm to us. I had a neighbor named Chris Christie who did something much less bad than what happened in Mubende, Uganda. He just created a traffic jam on a bridge, and he suffered enormous political consequences from it. That's our political economic rights in action that make us a problem-solving society. It's not utopia, but most economists sort of accept this viewpoint that political and economic rights are something that are really part of the big story of development, of how development happens, and how successful development happens. The strange thing is that that's not the view that really got applied to the rest of the world. That instead we embrace this more technocratic view that put the sort of experts in charge, and hence the title, The Tyranny of Experts. We turn things over to the experts to specify these long lists of technical solutions, and we didn't much care who did the technical solutions, so in practice, the ones who did them were the autocrats in power. So and I'm not saying the experts are bad people. I'm saying I'm going to explain some of the political forces behind what happened in this ascent of technocratic ideas. So one thing that explains how this technocratic vision happened in development is the fact that it's just very old and has been around for a very long time, much longer than people think. So at the time of the Articles of Agreement, which said that the World Bank was supposed to be neutral with respect to political systems, the sort of obvious political systems alternatives were dictatorship and democracy. But there's actually one other one that was still in existence at that time that the World Bank was supposed to also not object to, called colonialism. And that's actually very interesting part of the story of the technocratic idea of development that I'm going to cover in the next few minutes. So here's actually something that's a slide that's very illustrative of how, first of all, the technocratic approach has been around for a long time. So there was a colonial report done under the British by a British colonial officer named Lord Hailey that came out in 1938. And it listed these technical solutions. And I sneakily worked in a reference in the introduction to the chemical pyrethrum that you see here appears both in 1938 and then again in 2005 in a UN sort of a classic UN technocratic report that was a very long list of the technical solutions to the problems of the poor that thought that that was the answer to the end of poverty that would achieve development, technocratic development. I forget exactly who authored the UN 2005 report. I think it was some Columbia professor whose name I've forgotten, and possibly Angelina Jolie. But the couple things I want you to take away from this slide. One is just what I've already said. The technocratic approach has been around for a long time, and apparently has not been working well over these 7 decades because the same solutions were still required again in 2005. By the way, how's my voice level? Still good? Anyone complaining at this point? You won't be punished, don't worry. Yeah. Remember the metaphor? Is that working for you? So the problem was never really the shortage of technical knowledge. That's the myth of the technocratic approach, that the problem of poverty is a shortage of technical knowledge. And once the experts supply this missing technical knowledge, then poverty will be solved. Well, this slide kind of is evidence against that in an illustrative way. So poverty is not really about a shortage of experts, it's about a shortage of rights. It's the fact that the poor people in Africa have suffered through 7 decades of autocracy that started with colonialism, a form of autocracy called colonialism, and then continued later with technocratic justifications for later autocrats. Now, the technocratic idea is not only neutral with respect to autocracy, it's also actually a great justification for autocracy. Because, you know, if the answers are really just already known and just simply technical, then we all have kind of a strong instinct for just like wanting to avoid the messy democratic process where some idiot congressman might get the technical solution wrong. And we just want the all-knowing autocrat, the benevolent autocrat, to just put these technical solutions into place. And so there's a very strong sympathy between the technocratic view and kind of the authoritarian view. And the technocratic view is a great justification for authoritarian rule. And one of the first times it was used this way was actually when the benevolent autocrat was still the British Empire, the colonial authorities. So let me give you an example of this. There was a big debate during World War II between the Americans and the British about whether the British Empire should continue after the end of the war. There was some American soldiers didn't want to be fighting to defend the British Empire. And the British badly needed a justification for their empire to convince the Americans. So Lord Haley was still the point man at this point. And he did something very clever, which is he talked to the Roosevelt administration, FDR and Eleanor, and kind of convinced them of the technocratic justification for the British Empire. And the way he did that, he said, well, I've noticed that you guys are also using the technocratic idea to deal with your kind of internal colonial problem, which was the oppression of African Americans in the US. So during the New Deal, Roosevelt had lunched with a black leader named Ralph Bunche, and she had said to him, she tried to convince him that racism was most effectively attacked on the economic front, and suggested to him that he, quote, concentrate on the attainable goal of economic progress and postpone the challenge to segregation. And Lord Haley was saying the same thing about Africa. Let's postpone the issue of Africans' political rights, and let's in the meantime have the technocratic solution that will solve African poverty first, and then later they can have their rights, maybe if they want them in a few generations from now. At that time, neither segregation nor the colonialism was expected to end so soon as we know that they now did afterwards. Neither party expected either one to end. And so Lord Haley convinced FDR to go along with the British Empire for a while using this argument. And then afterwards, what happened was, of course, we know the civil rights movement happened, and American blacks demanded their own rights and rejected the technocratic idea. They said, we don't accept that, instead of I have a dream, we're just going to have better administration of welfare payments to American blacks. We do reject that idea. We want our rights. And when we get our rights, then we'll be able to, have the rights to demand the measures that we need for us to succeed. And of course, that revolution was partially successful, and it's still in progress today very much. But at least it was very clear that the key issue was rights, and that the technocratic, the concentration on material well-being was just an excuse to ignore rights, to postpone the discussion of rights. And so this is kind of like a key juncture in the history of the technocratic idea, because unfortunately, in the developing world, the technocratic idea still survived and still became an excuse for postponing any discussion of the rights of the poor. And so after the end of colonialism, several political things kind of lined up perfectly well. One is the US now wanted allies in the Cold War against the Soviets, and autocrats made better allies than Democrats did. Democrats were very unreliable allies. So to have a technocratic justification for an autocrat that your favorite autocrat who's helping you in the Cold War is also a benevolent autocrat doing technocratic development, that was a very convenient idea that really very much informed the early days of development economics in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then the other party that really liked these ideas were the new African autocrats. So it's essentially, to put it kind of in a one short sentence, what basically used to be the divine right of kings became the development right of dictators. That the ideas of technocratic development offered a big justification for why autocrats should stay in power and implement these technocratic recommendations. And so everyone was happy, except, the people without rights. There was one during this big debate that I just told you about, there was a British colonial secretary who was reviewing this debate and was very happy with Lord Haley's resolution of the whole matter on technocratic grounds. And he wrote a 3-word cover note that sort of sums up everyone's opinion about this technocratic compromise that I actually have a photographic facsimile of from an online picture of the original memo. And these are his typewritten words. This is, excellent. The technocratic idea is excellent for everyone except for the people without rights. So where are we today? Today we have people like Bill Gates. I'm a little cautious here because Ted told me he's one of the funders of this center, so maybe the live streaming should be blipped out in a few places here.
Doesn't work on Internet Explorer.
Yeah. Windows 8 just crashed on the live streaming. Bill Gates gave a statement about an Ethiopian autocrat named Meles Zenawi, who he said has, quote, he said this in the year 2012, he said, quote, has made real progress in helping the government, that was actually true, made real progress in helping the government of Ethiopia. That was a Freudian slip. The actual quote is, he has made real progress in helping the people of Ethiopia. Now that's a factual statement about how development is happening in Ethiopia, that I'm not criticizing necessarily the operations of the Gates philanthropy in Ethiopia. I'm criticizing Mr. Gates' own idea of how development happens. So his own idea is that the autocrat is part of the source of development in Ethiopia, and I'm saying the opposite. The autocrat is the problem. He's not the solution. The long history of autocracy in Ethiopia is why Ethiopia is poor. It's not the answer to Ethiopia's poverty. And then Mr. Gates went on to say that, quote, the government and the donors, that we set clear goals, we choose an approach, we measure results, and then we use these measurements to continually refine our approach. It helps us to deliver tools and services to everybody who will benefit. That was just a perfectly technocratic statement, which was why I couldn't resist picking on Bill Gates. So this is kind of the image of, a benevolent donor implementing technical solutions with the help of a benevolent autocrat, Mr. Meles Zenawi. And it's overlooking a few bits of direct evidence we have that Meles Zenawi was not so benevolent, that he shot down peaceful demonstrators in the streets after rigged elections in 2005. He manipulated food relief in 2010 to deny it to members of the opposition. He was caught red-handed by Human Rights Watch. The donors promised an investigation. Again, there was a non-investigation followed by a non-protest of the non-investigation of the abuse of aid. And lastly, this is something that became more personal with me a few days ago. A few days ago, I met an Ethiopian woman named Serkelam, who's the wife of Eskinder Nega. Eskinder Nega is an Ethiopian blogger. This is something I kind of identify with because I've been a blogger. Eskinder was just a blogger saying innocuous things about how during the Arab Spring, democracy might be a good thing for Ethiopia also. For this, he was sentenced to 18 years in jail. And he's still there serving 18 years in Ethiopian prisons. And his wife is now and their 10-year-old son is now in exile. And I met her at an event in D.C. a few days ago, and I was just overpowered by this. I'm sorry to introduce this personal element, but it just makes it so much more real and so much more compelling when you see what you think of as a purely technical issue resulting in such a real human tragedy, that somebody who is a guy named Eskinder who would help Ethiopia develop is instead serving 18 years in jail. So let me not go on too long here to leave lots of room for Q&A and back and forth. You might ask next, how do we operationalize these democratic principles in aid? So here's my 5 points. That it's always obligatory that at the end of every presentation you issue your 5-point PowerPoint slide on how to fix the problem. Here's my 5-point PowerPoint slide on how to fix the problem. Sorry. I've really done something unforgivable. I have no 5-point PowerPoint slide on how to fix the problem. This mentality of, what should aid do, how to operationalize this in aid, this is an intellectual prison. This is itself a technocratic distraction that has prevented us from debating this issue, of the rights of the poor. This is a very big issue. It's the key. Certainly, it must be at the heart of understanding how development really happens. And we need to have this debate and not be silenced by all these people insisting that within the first 5 minutes of the discussion, we've already moved immediately to an aid policy recommendation, which is the way the debate usually goes. You can't talk about anything unless within 5 minutes you've already gotten an aid policy recommendation. I'm sorry, I just refuse to play by those rules. There's bigger things going on in the world than aid policy. We have a big worldwide debate on freedom versus autocracy going on in the world today. We see it in Ukraine, in China, in Turkey, in Venezuela, in Ethiopia. And that's a much bigger debate, and we should not be distracted by the insistence of the aid agencies that they want to know how to do what this implies about how to do their jobs. Maybe we can spend some time later on discussing that, but that should not distract us from the big debate and from getting the principles right. Getting the principles right is itself a powerful force for social change. So let me again just give the example of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King, what did he do? Did he come up with 5-point PowerPoint slides on how to improve welfare policy towards blacks? No, he said, I have a dream, free at last, free at last. And fortunately, there wasn't anyone asking him, well, that free at last sounds so nice, but how do you operationalize, blah, 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 blah. We have to get the principles right. The problem then was that Southern whites and a lot of Northern whites did not agree that blacks and whites had equal rights. And I think the problem here is that really there's lots of us in this debate that really do not agree that the world's poor and the world's rich should have the same rights, the same political and economic rights. And we have to settle that question first before we talk about how to operationalize and how to change policy and what to do and what must we do and all those other questions. Let's just have the debate first. So let me close by just showing you my own sentimental, idealistic side by paraphrasing some very famous words. One thing that's another point of sort of evidence that these principles are actually much more powerful than 5-point PowerPoint slides on changing the world. That these are ideals and principles that people are willing to die for. And the statements of these principles are things that people remember for generations. And I'll quote one of these statements that you'll be very familiar with. That at a moment of crisis of our own on rights, one of our statesmen said that many years ago was stated a proposition that all men are created equal, that we're engaged in a battle, whether that proposition can endure. And let us just highly resolve that here today in development, as in everything else, we can have a new birth of freedom. and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
Thanks, Bill. I have a couple questions and points. There's a bunch of cards that have come in. If you haven't passed in a card with a question yet, I think there still are cards in the back. So as the conversation evolves, please go ahead and send them forward. A bunch of the questions ask the question you don't want to answer. So you set up your talk perfectly. I'm going to come back to that. I won't come to that first. I think for some of our students and others here, I think reaction that I had is they may be surprised that this wasn't the typical talk by an economist focusing on material conditions, focusing on GDP, focusing on what you call the technocratic solution. It's focusing on bigger philosophical themes, ideological themes, and they may be interested in how you go from doing technical work in economics with all the assumptions on optimality and all the things we do to writing in what seems a very different direction. So I don't know if you can talk about your own intellectual journey there.
Okay. Again, the sound check. You can hear me? Raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay, good. So, actually, I mean, I very much expect this reaction. Why is an economist talking about morality so much? I'm not the first economist to notice this. There's several other economists like Ed Glaeser, have written interesting articles called The Moral Heart of Economics. There's something about economics that actually makes us focus very much on the questions we're talking about today. So our basic model in Principles of Economics 101 is the principle of an individual who can make choices. So, that's our whole worldview. We're sort of, there's a sense in which, there's a saying, fish don't notice the water in which they swim. And there's a sense in which economics was created in free societies, taking for granted the freedom to choose. And then when we applied it to societies in which people are not free to choose, we sort of forgot to make any adjustment or forgot to assert how important this principle was to kind of inform our recommendations. And so let me say it in a more technical way. I mean, there's a principle in economics called revealed preference, which is a good example of how economists use this principle. That as usual in economics, it's a lot of jargon to say something extremely simple. Revealed preference is just you observe what someone chooses, and you infer from the fact that they chose that they must be better off. They chose something voluntarily, so they must be better off. So clearly that principle was egregiously violated in the example in Uganda. The Ugandan farmers did not have the right to choose whether to sell their land or not. They were evicted involuntarily. And so we're really lost once we lose that principle. If we don't know that people are consenting to the technical solutions that are being implemented, then we're really lost on knowing whether, in fact, they are or not better off. And so there's really something right at the heart of economics that makes, a lot of us and me really want to focus on this essential question, on the essential individual's right to choose. That's at the heart of it. And I guess to add a personal footnote to close this question, I think one formative experience I had was just writing a blog called Aid Watch for several years. And I first featured the Uganda story that I told you on the blog Aid Watch. And one thing about a blog, you can observe your traffic numbers, you can observe kind of the size of the audience response, you can really gauge how much response there is. And one thing that just really bothered me is that this story just got so little reaction on the blog compared to other blog stories I had done. The blog on Angelina Jolie and Jeff Sachs, just off the charts on traffic. That's kind of unfair comparison, but the blog on, the silly aid project that sells, the Super Bowl losers T-shirts saying that they won the Super Bowl to Zambians. That blog post, off the charts, getting traffic. White people doing something stupid to Africans, those always get, enormous responses in the general development discussion. White people violating the rights of Africans, that doesn't. And that really bothers me. And that really bothered me at the time, and I think that started this kind of journey towards this book that wound up with this book and this talk today.
There's a couple of questions that also, I think, bring together something that I was thinking as your talk was going on. Let me bring this one in. It's what your thoughts are on successful development stories like Singapore, China, cases where, they don't say it here, but presumably economic progress happened in the absence of the sort of political rights you're talking about. And then there's another question about asking you to give examples where the political rights turned into the economic progress that you talk about. So
Right. So let me say several things about that. First is I have a little bit of experience with this question because every time I give any talk anywhere related to this subject, the first question is always China. The second question is usually China. Third question is usually China or maybe Singapore. So I'm glad for that because it shows we're not talking about a straw man. There are lots of you, lots of possibly me in my past, who believe that autocrats could be actually doing great things for development. And so this is a real live debate that we're having about the second question, what are really the positive consequences of individual rights for development. Now, there was something very weird that happened at the beginning of the development field, which was that we decided to exclude from consideration as evidence the countries that were already developed. So all the stories that you're asking me about, or you're asking me to supply, you're asking me for what used to be called third world stories, excluding the first world. But there's something that's very strange about this whole use of evidence at the beginning of development that very much supported the technocratic approach at the beginning. It's like saying, in trying to decide how to succeed at development, we're going to exclude from consideration any models who have succeeded at development. It just did not make sense. So I think one great thing that has happened in the academic literature, and by the way, this book does talk much more than this talk did about the academic literature and about the evidence for and against these propositions that freedom versus autocracy is good or bad for development. One great thing that has happened in the academic literature is we've talked a lot more about the role of history, the historical experience of the developed countries, which really should also be called developing countries. They are still developing. It's still a work in progress. But certainly that's a huge body of at least stylized facts that suggests a lot of development success happened in societies that did have a lot of individual rights. And then why are we getting so excited about China? We're getting excited about China not because of its level, which is still only like 1/6 or 1/10, depending on extremely uncertain measures of GDP of the US level. So we're not talking about the levels, which should be really the relevant evidence for whether development succeeds or not. We're excited about China because it has a very rapid growth rate. So there's two ways to have a very rapid growth rate. One is to do things extremely badly and start with a very low level of income. So China was good at that. It had this insane totalitarian in power who did the Great Leap Forward and a huge famine that killed tens of millions and a cultural revolution. And before that, there were huge, long periods of just unbroken autocracy and warlords and chaos and a dictator, a fascist dictator named Chiang Kai-shek in pre-revolutionary China. So just enormous chaos and violence and totalitarianism. And that's the starting point for China. And then the second thing that happened is a positive change in freedom in China, that Chinese citizens today have much greater rights, even political rights, personal rights, rights to choose than they did under Mao, than they did under warlords and chaos under the empire. And certainly even a larger positive change in economic freedom. So the correlations we should be looking for as stylized facts should be like levels of freedom predict high levels of prosperity. That one seems to fit the stylized facts. And second, that positive changes in freedom should go with positive changes in development, which we call high economic growth. That seems to fit the stylized facts in China. And so we seem to have a story that fits the stylized facts. Now, one thing that we have to admit is that this evidence is not completely rigorous and it has problems of causality. But you know, what we have to do in economics, we don't have the luxury of just believing in nothing. No one just says like, oh, this whole debate on democracy versus autocracy, I'm just going to believe in nothing. You know, you have to choose. So you choose, first of all, probably based on your values, which is the first question, but that's not fair to invoke that. But if we're going to choose on the hypothesis of which is better for development, then what really matters is the relative weight of the evidence. Even if the evidence doesn't pass some absolute rigor of standard of resolving all questions of causality, and you know, we can't do field experiments of, you know, some people agree to be slaves to some autocrat and other people agree to be exerting their rights, and some people agree to have their homes burnt down by soldiers, and others agree to make their own choices. And you know, we can't run those experiments. We can't get that kind of rigorous evidence, but we still have to choose based on which side is kind of the, you know, and it's basically just saying which theory better fits the big stylized facts about the world. And I think that theory would be that individual rights support development, fits the big stylized facts better than the opposite theory that you need autocracy to get development.
The next series of questions I think are particularly appropriate to ask at a university, which is there's a couple of questions that ask about the role of research in the process, research about development, a question about the role of this trend towards RCTs, you know, randomized experiments in development, but a couple of questions about, you know, what is the role of those generating evidence? There's the critique of the technocratic solution that uses that evidence, but then what is the role of that research community and research process in all this?
Yeah, I'm very glad you're asking that question, because that's, so, you know, in making a kind of moral argument to really make a case for treating freedom as an end in itself and making a positive case that freedom does in fact pay off, this is really a contribution to the big public policy debate about development and the big public policy debate around the world about people sort of making choices about, are they going to fight for democracy in their own societies, or are they really content to live with autocracy? That's what this book and these arguments are meant to address. Certainly not meaning to like tell anyone how to do their research. Research is what it is. I have no criticism of how academic research is being done. And well, I have my own criticisms that are separate from this topic of how academic research and development is being done. There's lots of ways it can be improved. What I'm certainly not going to be doing is making a moral point is not going to be telling anyone how to do research or how they should do their research or what they should find in their research. Nothing like that. Academic research is what it is. It should continue following the same methods that it's following now, of not commenting on any, you know, real specific methodologies, but just the general methodology of kind of hypothesis testing against the best available evidence and different bodies of evidence being available. And so you know, that's what's informing this positive debate that I'm arguing we should be having a lot more of whether democracy or autocracy is better for development. And I think that debate is mainly being influenced by these big stylized facts. And where academic research is useful here, I think, is at least it's, even if it's not meeting some rigorous standards like randomized controlled trials do, it's certainly a lot better than just citing some random anecdote, which is how the public policy debate usually happens. You know, what's usually happening now is, you know, people just say, you know, Deng Xiaoping, and the debate is over. Or they say Lee Kuan Yew, and the debate is over. It's basically just sort of cocktail party conversation about what's better for development, democracy or autocracy. And it's our duty as economists to do a lot better than that. And that's what I think a lot of the academic research on democracy versus autocracy has done, even if it hasn't reached the RCT level of rigor. It has placed a lot more of the relative weight of evidence on the democracy side, as I argued before.
There's an interesting question here. About trends in the development world, development policy world, and are there any trends that you see being positive, kind of going in the direction of what you see as a good way forward? And in particular, a kind of application of that is, do you see the drive towards governance programs, community-driven development methodologies as part of a good trend forward in the development policy world?
Again, Q&A is wonderful because it allows sort of corrections to things that might be mistaken impressions from the talk. One mistaken impression might be that there's a gloomy outlook, and really there isn't. The outlook is really positive because the trends in democracy, in political rights, and economic rights around the world over the past several decades are very positive. Don't forget we've had the fall of the Berlin Wall that's liberated a large section of Eastern Europe. We've had a big decline in the most brutal and ugly military dictatorships in Latin America and Africa and in Asia. It's not utopia, and there is no, that's another thing I want to clarify. I'm not saying that we need some kind of utopian level of rights before anything good will happen. I'm saying that there will be, as we make progress towards greater rights, there will also be progress towards greater development, and that's exactly what we see going on around the world, that the ideas of these rights are spreading, and they are having a positive effect around the world already. Now, and that's mainly coming from poor people themselves demanding their own rights, mounting democratic protest to drive military rulers out of power and to elect imperfectly democratic rulers. Again, you can't flip a switch overnight and go from autocracy to some democratic utopia. That's not on the table. It will never happen. It's gradual, it's messy, it's transitional. But it is happening around the world, and it is a positive trend. And so that, I think, is the hopeful thing. Now, as far as the aid stuff, again, I think it's a fairly small player in the whole picture. I mean, those of you who are directly involved in aid, more power to you as you're trying to promote in using the tools of the aid system these objectives of better governments and more democracy and more rights for citizens. More power to you. All I'm trying to say is that we should not look at things backwards. Aid is such a small player that we should really give. If we really want to know how development happens and understand how development happens and participate in the big debate about how development happens, that it's mainly about rights, then it's just a kind of a distraction to focus on the efforts that aid is making. Let me try out one metaphor that I've been thinking about using. I've never tried to use before, so I'll try it out on you. So here's a way to help you visualize how small aid is as a player. So if the entire economy of the developing world was a 6-foot-tall individual, so just picture a 6-foot-tall individual. Could be, of either gender. It could be this very handsome 6-foot-tall man. So I definitely am not. Could be a very attractive 6-foot-tall woman who's got a PhD in biology. That's the image I want you to have. Okay, what is aid? Aid is if that person held up their fingers like this, 1/3 of an inch. Aid is 1/3 of an inch compared to a 6-foot-tall person. That's the relative magnitudes of the size of the economy of the developing world and the magnitude of aid. So, most of that economy was created by the efforts of poor people themselves. It was not created by the 1/3 of an inch. How's that metaphor work for you? Should I use that again? How many say yes? How many say no? Okay.
So it's a haircut.
It's a haircut, yeah.
There's a very...
If you're part of that 1/3 of an inch, more power to you. You're helping a lot of people. You're doing a lot of good. More power to you. But let's be clear about the 1/3 of an inch.
Well, there's, I think, maybe a perfect concluding question. It's closely related, and maybe perfect here in the Blum Center. We're in the College of Engineering. There's a lot of interest among our engineering students in development, and I think you've partially answered this with a previous question. It says, on a personal note, what advice would you give to an engineering student interested in global poverty alleviation? What can they do? And I don't know if the answer is, from what you just said, not so much, but I think that's... I think that's the question that's on a lot of students' minds in this room who have this, passion for these issues, what can they do in their own lives, or what can they do in their work?
Well, actually, I'm going to say something a lot more hopeful than that. So, when I talk about the technocratic solution, kind of overemphasizing technical solutions, the overemphasis is the omission of the political system as the problem. In a well-functioning political system that does give economic and political rights, technology works marvels. Technology does have enormous payoffs when free people are the ones who are selecting and implementing these technical solutions and inventing these technical solutions. And of course, most technologies were invented in free societies. It's freedom that made possible the invention of the breakthrough technologies that engineering takes advantage of. But there's other ways in which technology can spread that can work around oppressive autocratic governments. There can be sort of people-to-people spread of technology. And that is what has, in fact, been happening all over the world. And it has already accounted for a lot of progress in the developing world. There are historical examples, like after the discovery of the New World, new crops spread around the world through increased communications and the reduction of transport costs. So like, for example, cocoa came to Ghana and was mainly adopted by smallholders in Ghana. So the existence of the cocoa plant was, I forget where it was invented first. I used to know that, but I forgot already. And it came to Ghana, and it made possible enormous breakthroughs. Other technologies are spreading, like mobile phones spread to Africa and have done enormous good by spreading to Africa much more recently. So, you as an engineering student, you could be part of this sort of people-to-people spread of technology that we've already identified as a huge historical force that's contributing to global development. And so that you are involved in something that is doing a lot of good at a people-to-people level and just helping to spread technology. I'm not saying anything that opposes that whatsoever. You are part of the solution when you, as a free individual, are able to offer new choices to individuals in poor societies that didn't have those technical choices before. You are part of the solution. And so I'm not saying that you should just give up and go home. Quite the contrary. The fact that you in a free society have been able to learn these technologies now makes you potential ambassadors of these technologies to unfree societies that did not invent these technologies but can absorb them as you spread them as people-to-people ambassadors that work around these oppressive governments. And so there is a lot of hope, both on two counts now that we've identified. One, that you can spread technology around oppressive governments, and two, that governments really are becoming less and less oppressive over time. Freedom is spreading around the world, and so the future is bright with hope.
Well, thanks, Bill, and maybe another round of applause for Bill. Thank you. I think there are books in the back, and Bill will make his way over there for some signings, I think, in a few minutes. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And thanks to the Blum Center again for hosting.